my book, just to mention for those who don't know, deals with the top most important economists and looks at how they have actually looked at inequality. It starts with Francois Quesnay before the French Revolution, then goes to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Wilfredo Pareto, and Simon Kuznets. And then in the last chapter, which covers the period that you actually alluded to, from 1960 to 1990, the book ends about the end of the Cold War. I think quite clear if one reads, especially The Wealth of Nations, is that it is a book written clearly based on the idea of self-interest, whereas Theory of Moral Sentiments is based on the idea of empathy. But when people say that, they somehow, under the influence of Amartya Sen, believe that the Theory of Moral Sentiments is pro-left in the sense because it's sort of softer. But in the reality, actually, when you read the two of them, it's the opposite. It's actually The Wealth of Nations is extremely tough book regarding capitalists. It is a tough book regarding any type of organization. So the government is an organization. So obviously Adam Smith, as we all know, because that part of Adam Smith has been propagated, is very hard on government regulation and on government trying to impose the rules that they themselves, people of the government, don't observe. Like, for example, corruption. They could be corrupt themselves, but they impose the rules on the others that they should not be corrupt. Then it's very tough on all, as I said, associations, including organized religion. And it's somewhat tough, but not too much, on labor unions, and I will explain later why not so much. But it's extremely critical of any organized capitalist associations. And that part of The Wealth of Nations is hardly ever mentioned because it is not something that the Chicago School and then the Wall Street Journal or others want to hear, but in extremely tough in the sense, and the reason is the following. He believes that, of course, capitalists are few in numbers, so they can coordinate much more easily than workers. Workers are thousands of them or millions dispersed, but capitalists, of course, are actually very few in numbers. They can coordinate better, and they can have much greater influence on government policy because, as he says, they are sophisticated and even casuistic in their argumentation, whereas workers, of course, are less educated and they don't have that access to the power. So specifically, for example, he mentions that there should not be government facilitation of capitalist meetings. And this is so bizarre when you read that during Davos, because it is a total reversal of the situation which existed even like 50 years ago, that the government would not go ostensibly and show itself at the meeting of capitalist leaders. You know, the government had in those days to keep itself at least formally separate. But nowadays, as you can see at Davos, they actually sort of, they are keen to go there. Then the second question, I will be brief on that, relates to the absence of the studies during the Cold War economics. Now, for the economics, my rationale was the following. To say that it was only, neoclassical economics, which it was, is to some extent accurate, but it had something else. And that something else was really a politically motivated attempt to deny the existence of social classes. And that goes back to similar denial which existed in socialist countries because, of course, they claimed to have eliminated capitalist class and then to have a classless society. And the US, as we know, was in an ideological, among other competitions, there was an ideological competition with the Soviet Union and communist countries. So the US essentially claimed, which doesn't come strangely because US always claimed to some extent to be classless society, but then the economists started claiming the same because the point was, okay, neoclassical economics says to us that everybody has some type of assets. And then, of course, as you know, they started using subscripts for assets. There was no more capital and labor. They were all hundreds of assets, and they were subscripted. You can put I, J, K, L, M, whatever. And thereby, the main dividing line, which is a very strong line, because obviously to get income from one asset like capital, you don't need to work. And to get income from another asset like labor, you do have to work. This very strong line, and on top of that, of course, the influence of the two are not the same politically, was submerged, erased, ignored. So that's why I believe to call it only neoclassical economics was not sufficient. We have really to put that prefix of neoclassical and Cold War economics. So that was my rationale for the name. You know, that's an interesting point that you mentioned. You know, and indeed Pareto is very often criticized because of his theory of the elites, circulation of the elites, sort of, as you said, nihilistic tendencies, and even he is criticized of being at some point close to an ideological, how should they say, ideological supporter, or rather ideological progenitor of fascism. That is, you know, not totally clear. You know, he died in 1923, just less than a year after Mussolini came to power. Mussolini gave him a title of a senator because he was just giving the titles, you know, whether, I actually don't know whether Pareto really wanted the title or not. But I have to say that I'm less critical to some extent ideologically of Pareto than on what happened during Cold War economics. So let me explain. Because for Pareto, inequality still was based on a prior distinction between what he called the elite, which nowadays is basically what we call top 1%, and everybody else. What neoclassical or Cold War economics did was totally obliterate any difference. So the claim is actually more extravagant in the case of neoclassical economics. The claim is that actually we are all the same. The claim is that, you know, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and a beggar are technically the same. They are both individuals who are under the conditions of uncertainty, and given the constraints that they have and the endowments they have, they maximize. So anybody with common sense would say, well, they are not the same. Not only that their incomes are different and their wealth is different, time horizons are different, ability to withstand lack of income is different, ability to influence political decisions is different, perception of them is different from the people. So everything is different. And of course, Pareto would agree with that because he would place one of them in the elite and the other into the, you know, people. Now, it is true that Pareto, by his writings, and I think that's what you also alluded, like also philosophers of the time, and I actually am not that familiar, but for example, one can maybe take Nietzsche, for example, as a, was in some sense a very, how should I say, dismissive of any form of democratic organization, believing that all of them are essentially fake. In other words, as you know, he actually uses Machiavelli there. He says every elite has to justify its rule. So there are elites which are like lions, which justify the rule by force, and there are the elites which are more sophisticated. They're like foxes. They justify the rule through creating an ideology. But it is true, you mentioned that, his view of the world is very much a reaction against Marx and the large workers' movement, which in his opinion, and that he is actually similar to Schumpeter in that, he is very much against that, but he thinks that they would win. Yeah, so he sees actually the proletarian movement well organized with people who are actually willing to sacrifice themselves. Mm-hmm. And he makes the analogy between that movement and Christianity, because Christianity won eventually because people were ready to be sent to the lions and to be killed and to actually sacrifice a lot. So he saw a socialist movement.
He finds the bourgeois liberals as lazy persons.
Yes, bourgeois liberals actually maybe a majority even. They want to keep the society as it is, but they're not going to go out in the street demonstrating and fighting the workers. And he saw workers and, of course, the organized proletariat, which actually comes, these are interesting, I think, links which are not explored in the book. And, of course, Pareto also liked very much to shock. And so he liked, maybe that's another similarity with the nihilistic thinkers of the time, and maybe with Nietzsche, is that he definitely liked to shock bourgeoisie by making statements like that virtually every society, in order to survive, has to believe in a lie, in a big lie. And that obviously included religion there as well. He saw religion as essentially a myth, which is being created in order to maintain society. I saw very clearly how the focus of inequality, and actually I have to say that it is, to some extent, I am imposing sort of a view, in the sense that, you know, people like Kenne or even Smith, they didn't use the word inequality, but I studied like implicitly how they view it, because they talk basically about factoral incomes, meaning, you know, income from wages, labor, income from interest and profits from capital, and rent from landlords. But the evolution is as follows. You start with Kenne before the French Revolution. He actually introduces, that's why Marx liked him also, he introduces the idea of class. Now, the classes are basically like the French classes before the revolution. They were legal estates. So there was what we call like class propriétaire, which is composed of the clergy, aristocracy, and government officials. And they are the ones who receive the surplus. So that was a totally new approach. As you can see, it's very class-based, but it's a legally defined classes. Then, as you mentioned, you have this sort of trilogy, or three big authors, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, that very clearly follow the definition of class, which is based on economic ownership of different assets, and of course legal equality, because legally, of course, capitalists have the same legal rights as workers and landlords. Then we come to Pareto with this distinction between the elite and everybody else, and we just talked about him. Then we come to Kuznets with a distinction between, and of course we follow the development of capitalism, because the three big authors, Smith, Ricardo, and Keynes, are actually at the time of the classical capitalism. Pareto is already at the time, as we were saying before, of a reaction to that and the sort of more evolved capitalism. And then we come to Kuznets in the US, where capitalism is sort of ignored in this class aspect, and he brings in the distinction between agricultural and manufacturing workers and rural and urban areas. So it's an entirely different distinction. And then we finally come to no distinction at all. So this is really the evolution. We really go from legally defined to economically defined classes, to the elite, to the classes defined by essentially type of work they perform and the place where they perform it, to basically, and that was, of course, for me, one of the major issues with neoclassical, to no distinction at all. So that was the evolution. I think that the last evolution was really politically motivated for the reasons that I mentioned before, but they do correspond to the movement of capitalism. Now, if I may, just, it's a long answer, but if I may say only one person about whom I had doubt, I wanted to include him, and I include him a little bit, but not as a full profile, was Samin Amin. And the reason was that neo-Marxist and Samir brought a new brought a new look at inequality domestically as being influenced by external forces. And nobody that I mentioned before had this view until Amin came, and of course neo-Marxist economists, because in every author, inequality is the result of internal forces. But then with Samir Amin, inequality, for example, in Egypt, is the result of foreign forces favoring a given type of inequality domestically, and that type is then maintained because it is actually good for the whatever the capitalist global order. So that was an entirely new view that Samir Amin brought. So I was considering having him as number 7, but for many reasons, eventually I did not. But he's still in the book. Well, that's a very good question. I actually think all of them are relevant in some ways. Let me just, since you ended with Kuznets. Kuznets, when he defined his famous inverted U-shaped curve, he knew only the situation up to 1955 or actually 1960s, because he still continued writing. But you can apply the same logic of the Industrial Revolution or technological revolution to the later revolutions, including today's. So then you could actually argue that we are now going through the upward cycle of the new Kuznets wave, which is not dissimilar from the upward cycle of the previous Kuznets wave. And I really would like to emphasize very important points from Adam Smith, which are, number one, is that the welfare of the largest group is the objective economic policy. And that was new at that time. Secondly, all organized associations have to be looked with a skeptical eye. And third, capitalists should not rule economic policy because their interests very often go against the public. So I think these are really very important messages from the Wealth of Nations. And when you say, when you speak of Adam Smith as a moralist, I have here, and it's not in the book, unfortunately, but I thought of this later. I really have come to think of the theory of moral sentiments as a job market paper that Adam Smith did, because it actually pushes all the right tones for somebody who is a professor of basically jurisprudence, and who actually, he himself is divided on the organized, he's against organized religion, but his religious feelings cannot be fully expressed. And as we know, he really remained very ambivalent, at least in public. And so it is a book, a paper that shows him as a theistic philosopher who is actually a moral philosopher and does all the things that are expected from him to defend in a very sophisticated way. But in the Wealth of Nations, he's no longer writing a job market paper. He's writing really what he believes and what is actually the result of having observed the world for, at that time he was, I think, he was more than 50. And so I think it is a very different view of the world. So I think actually that the current situation is quite different from this Cold War economics. And I think it's different for two reasons. First of all, the end of communism in the Soviet Union no longer, there was no longer the need on the capitalist or the US side to insist so much on classless aspect of their society, because the other side simply disappeared. So that gives you much greater freedom politically to actually go in the directions that politically were difficult before. And secondly, I think that, as always, there are important political or economic turning points that make a difference. And I think that the 2008 crisis was important for the study of inequality, because it brought realization to the mass of people, to the middle class people, that what they believed was increased standard of living was to some extent an illusion built, particularly in the United States, on the ability to borrow. As you know, the household loans were actually more than 100% of the GDP, and people could borrow very easily. George W. Bush actually then started saying that everybody should borrow to have a house, and people who had no jobs or kind of random jobs and no incomes were actually also able to borrow, which of course was propagated by the rich people and the banking system. So practically everybody participated in that, as we actually know that quite well. The banks were interested in packaging the loans and getting the fees, and the rich people had excess monetary balances which they had to place somewhere. But that whole thing crashed in 2008, and it could have been much worse, obviously, were it not for the ability of the government to print money and to basically bail the banks out. But for the middle class, it was a big awakening, because it was a big awakening because the top 1% actually did pretty well. And then came also the issue of China, outsourcing of jobs, and so forth. So that economic shock was something that opened the gates to the study of income distribution. And of course, Piketty's book was, of course, a big contributor, but one should not forget that, like everything, every time in history, a certain ideological trend is successful when it comes on the terrain which is ready for it. If Piketty's book, and actually he had another book before, or several books before, but if it was written in 2005, the terrain was not ready. It would be there, and maybe some people would read it, some people would not, but there would be nothing similar to what happened in 2013. So that was the, as I said, conjunction of the political events, end of the Cold War, economic event, which was the financial crisis, the so-called global financial crisis, and the third one is the ideological, new ideological view of income distribution. I think to some extent Pareto was probably more right in the sense that that socialist countries did replicate two things that Marx did not believe they would actually have. The first one, they did create a new, different, but new class society where it was not access to capital which mattered because the capital was nationalized, but access to the bureaucratic hierarchy that was to some extent like a new class. And secondly, but on that I'm less convinced that actually there was, of course, income inequality in socialist countries, but it is true that that inequality was less than in the equivalent capitalist countries. So yes, they have reduced inequality, they have not reduced it to a minimum, but on that part, I think it's difficult to say because Marx indeed, I think, believed that once the underlying institutions are right, which means the underlying institutions do not have private ownership of capital, that income distribution would become an important topic, but that inherently it could not be high because you don't have private capital, because everybody has access to schooling, because manual labor would be sort of more valued relatively to the intellectual labor. So in some sense, he was right there. So I'm not exactly, but I think Pareto was right that there was a new class being created.